Hey folks, Joe Badman here for Basis. One of the questions that we get asked quite often is, I'm struggling to get started to apply some of this agile stuff to the projects that I'm working on. What would you recommend that I do? There are many answers to that question, but one practical solution is just to apply some of this stuff to you to do agile for one. And I have three hypotheses what will happen if you do that. So number one, you'll just get a few more things done, which feels good. Number two, that will reduce your anxiety. The work will feel a bit more manageable and you'll be a bit more motivated to come and have a crack on the following day. And number three is that people will start to get interested in what you're doing. And that might make the conversation about introducing a more agile way of working to projects just a little bit easier. So we'll use me as a case study. These are the practices that I use and the principles that I try to follow. What's relevant to know about me? So I lead an organization, I work on messy projects, I try and develop new opportunities, I create content like this and kind of talk at conferences. I do kind of really boring stuff, really important administrative stuff that has to do with running a company. I'm only mentioning this because on a given day, I could be doing 100 different things. And I have to make relative prioritization decisions, like what relative to everything else is most important for me to do? What's going to be my highest point of contribution for this week? Now, watching this, you could be somebody who's way busier than me. You could be somebody who's not as busy as me. And that's not important. What's relevant is that if you're the kind of person that has to make trade-offs like the ones I'm describing about what you do on a day-to-day basis, then hopefully there'll be some stuff in here that is useful. So let's start with a really simple practice. So I treat my week like a 1 week sprint. My weeks, in my head at least, run Friday to Friday. And the last thing that I do on a Friday afternoon is I look at my emails, my instant messages, my backlog, my calendar, all kinds of things will have flown in over the course of the week. And I'll say, knowing what I now know about what's happened this week, what's the most important thing for me to focus on next week? And I dump it all into a list. It's not a particularly long list. There's usually no more than 10 things in it. But at this point, I will challenge myself. I will say, hey, is it actually realistic that you're going to get through all of that stuff? And if the honest answer is no, then I will deprioritize some things and put them in my backlog, or maybe even in the parking lot, stuff that I'll come back to at a later date. Or perhaps I'll try and delegate some things. Now, the principle that I'm trying to follow here is to focus on the essential few over the trivial many. There's all kinds of things I could be doing, but they're not all essential. Now, if you don't do this prioritization, this ruthless prioritization, things go wonky really, really quickly. And here's one good reason why. This is a now very famous study by Weinberg, 1991. And essentially, they tried to figure out what happens to our productivity when we start working on many different projects all at the same time. When you're working on one thing, you can put all your energy into it. But as soon as you take on another, something weird happens. You have to switch contexts. You have to remember, what was I doing? Who was I talking to? What was the next thing that I needed to do? You burn a bunch of processing power during that non-value adding activity, and that's called a switching cost. The problem is this gets worse the more projects you add. By the time you get to 5 projects, you're doing them all at the same time, you lose about 80% of your capacity to switching costs. So unless you prioritize in the way that I'm describing, you just have to accept that you will make snail's progress on many things all at the same time. And perhaps you'll miss the window of opportunity that priority was designed to take advantage of in the first place. Not good. Now, how you go about doing this prioritization is a longer conversation. Usually have to do it as teams and organizations. Maybe I'll make a video on that again in the future. Practice number 2, I try and keep track of my work using a personal Kanban board. The tool you actually use isn't so important. You could use Microsoft Teams Planner if you're in a local authority and you use that. You can use Trello. I'm pretty agnostic. They're all much of a muchness. But here's how mine is set up. I've got a parking lot, which has about 30 things in it. And that's stuff that I know I will need to get around to at some point, but it's not super time sensitive. Maybe it's kind of important, but not urgent stuff, or perhaps it's just some stuff that I want to do in there. My backlog, that's things that I need to do maybe within the next month. That's kind of loosely what I'm thinking. And there's about 30 things in there. This week, I've already talked about that. To do, there's only 3 things in there, and I'll talk about why that is in just a second. Then I've got doing, blocked, and done. And in my done column, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and I'll explain why that is in just a second. But what I'm trying to do here is, aside from just kind of visualize what's going on, that's really important to me, I'm trying to practice and celebrate radical incrementalism. That's why there's only 3 things in the to-do list. Now, that doesn't mean I'm doing 3 things all at the same time. It just means there's only 3 things that I'm focusing on at any given moment. There's two good reasons for that. First of all, if I've only got 3 things on my to-do list, I can prioritize pretty easily between them. As soon as that list grows to 10, 20, 15 things, how do you decide what's more important than the other stuff on the list? Also, if somebody needs help urgently or something flies in, it's mega easy for me to figure out what's more important, this thing or the 3 things. And if it's this thing, which of the 3 things am I going to park for now? Really, really useful. Now, practicing radical incrementalism is something I've only been doing in the last year. I got the idea from Oliver Burkeman's book for 4,000 Weeks, and it's made an enormous difference, not only to my productivity, but also for the levels of just general anxiety I'm carrying around at any given moment about the amount of stuff I need to do. It helps me compartmentalize and focus on the most important stuff. Here's the third practice. Have frequent stand-ups with people you are working with. Well, if you're working in an Agile team, say maybe you're in a Scrum team, you would be having daily stand-ups with people in order to figure out who's doing what people have just done, and whether or not folks are blocked. Now, there's no reason why you can't have frequent conversations with people that you're collaborating with. In my case, I maybe have 6 or 7 of these slots booked in over the course of the week. They're only 10 or 15 minutes long. It takes some planning with the people that I need those conversations with. But once they're in, they're incredibly effective, and they help to bust through things that would otherwise take goodness knows how many instant messages or emails to work out just by chatting about them. Now, the principle here is that when ambiguity is high, feedback is your friend. What do I mean by that? Well, in basis, most of our work is highly ambiguous. That means that we're doing kind of complex stuff. It's not clear exactly what the problem nor the solution is. And in those circumstances, getting frequent feedback input from people helps to make rapid progress. So when ambiguity is high, close the feedback loop, have conversations, and that will help you work through that kind of work much more quickly. Here's another practice. Reflect on your progress. Again, if you're working in an Agile team, you'll probably be having retrospectives. Now, they serve all kinds of functions. They help you to work out how the team is functioning, how they're collaborating, and whether or not there are opportunities to improve that collaboration. And that's important. But they also remind you of all the kind of good stuff that has just happened over the course of the week, and that feels good. And actually, in scientific terms, it's proved to be really, really effective. We'll come on to that in just a second. Now, I try and reflect in several different ways. I write a week note at the end of the week. This is Basis's playbook, which lives in Notion. You can see my week notes there are down on the right-hand side. So I try and connect the dots between all the things that have happened in the company, all the different kind of bits of progress that are happening on different projects or little successes that have happened. But I use it as an opportunity for me to think about my own work and my own progress. And it reminds me if something kind of didn't go so well, it reminds me of that thing. And I can make a note for myself to not do that thing again, or maybe leave an action for myself to make sure that I don't repeat the same mistake. Now, if you're in a leadership position, this can be a really, really useful way of helping your team as a whole see the progress that they're making, perhaps towards some bigger strategic aim that perhaps they can't see on a day-to-day basis. But for me personally and selfishly, it's a really helpful way of enabling me to reflect as an individual. Another thing that I try and remember, principle I try and follow, is not to underestimate the small wins that I'm making. So I mentioned that I've got this kind of Kanban board and there's loads of stuff in that done column. To be specific, there are about 2,500 things that I've accomplished in that done column. At the end of every task that I've completed, big or small, it goes in there and I never archive it. This, over time, just makes me feel good about myself. Great piece of research by Marbley and Kramer. Highly recommend checking it out. The Power of Small Wins. There's a Harvard Business Review article on it if you want a summary. Basically found that there is nothing more motivating than the sense of one's own progress. Now, I take for granted that the work you're doing is meaningful, because motivation is a weak surrogate for meaning, as my colleague Dennis often says. But if the work is meaningful, just seeing small steps forward is enormously motivating. So I'm kind of playing a little psychological hack on myself. Seeing these things add up over time makes me just a little bit more motivated the next day and the next day and the next day. And overall, that improves my productivity. So look, here are a few recaps. Treat your week like a sprint. This doesn't take much thought. Make sure you got some planning time booked in. and just be realistic about how much stuff you're actually going to be able to get through, because you need to focus on the essential few and avoid the trivial many. Avoid context switching. It's really, really detrimental to your own productivity, and it's super frustrating. Celebrate radical incrementalism. Be a radical incrementalist. If you want to find out more about that, check out Oliver Burkeman's book. It's really, really transformative. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. What do I mean by that? Have conversations with people. If ambiguity is high, use relationships and conversations to move things on. Don't rely on messages and reports and stats on how much progress is being made. That's not going to help you if you're doing complex knowledge work. Conversations are king when dealing with that kind of challenge. Reflect on your own progress. You can do that in several ways. If it's writing a week note, fantastic. Maybe it's just writing a little journal entry at the end of the week. And definitely don't archive all the kind of good stuff that you've done. Over time, those small wins will impact your own personal motivation. But the final thing that I want to leave you with is this. This is the thought or insight, I suppose, that has been most impactful to me. Liberate yourself from the idea that you can and should do more. This is a bit philosophical, but to be human is to only be around for a finite period of time. Now, the unfortunate thing is that we have an infinite number of possibilities, and the amount of information that we're consuming on a daily basis just reminds us of those infinite possibilities. But as soon as you get comfortable with the fact that you literally cannot do everything, and you certainly can't do it all at the same time, it makes just letting stuff go and prioritizing a little bit easier. So that's how I go about this. I would love to hear how other people approach their own kind of productivity and their own prioritization. If you've got ideas, things I could try, let me know. If you try any of this stuff out, I want to know if it helped. So I think that is it. I'm going to share this in several places, but definitely in our community of practice. So if you're not signed up to that, then you should try and get involved for access to content like this before everybody else gets it. That's it for today. Peace.